Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do today is give a response to CosmicSkeptic's video about his thoughts that he didn't think morality could be objective, even if God exists, which he doesn't think God exists. And I wanted to kind of sketch out a possible, well, I guess I just want to talk about why I think moral objectivity and God are actually a very good match. If you don't know CosmicSkeptic, definitely go check out his channel. I'll have a link. He has a great channel. I really enjoy watching his stuff. I think he's very thoughtful and very charitable and things. And there are a lot of atheist and skeptical YouTubers that I'm not a big fan of. And I have reasons for why, but he's one of the ones I really enjoy watching. And I can stand watching, and I think he makes some good points. And some of these points are points that I've thought about too. So I don't want this to be like an attack or like me claiming that I think he's just dead wrong and an idiot or anything like that. I just want to explore some of these ideas. And I mean, I do think he's wrong about moral objectivity and God being incompatible, but I don't think he's way off. I don't want to say I don't think he's off the mark. I think he's asking good questions. I just think I've come to a different conclusion, and I'll explain why in this video. So the first thing we want to do, if we're going to talk about the compatibility of God with moral objectivity, is we need to ask what we mean by objective. And in my understanding of Alex's argument, and if you know his argument better than I do, like correct me if I'm wrong, is his idea that morality can't be objective even with the existence of God, is there's not exactly a reason to care about what God says. And the idea being like, okay, if a kid's parent tells him, okay, Charlotte, clean your room. And the kid doesn't want to clean their room. Charlotte doesn't want to clean her room. So she asks her parent, why? And the parent maybe would say, because I said so. For most kids, this is fine. But if Charlotte wants to press this a little further, may say, why should I care what you say? It doesn't make me want to clean my room anymore necessarily. Like, you saying it doesn't make me care. To which the parent has two options. One, they can offer a practical reason for the kid to care. Hey, like, clean your room or you're not going to get any dinner tonight. Or they can try to basically push authority to a higher order. So they may say, you ought to care what I say because God says so. And if Charlotte's a philosophical child, maybe she's going to ask, well, why should I care what God has to say? And I think at this point, we can still make the argument that there's still another practical level of concern when it comes to the Judeo-Christian God. There's still a practical level of accountability. It's just that practical level of accountability is kind of at a different level. So, on a very, very, very basic level, you just have, okay, God says to do this stuff, and if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. Just super, super basic. And I don't think that's going to necessarily, whether that's a logical reason is one thing, but I think at a certain point, all moral prescriptions come down to some level of practicality. And I think Alex's argument is that there's no reason to care about the prescription of God, or that there's no inherent to-be-doneness of anything. And if God commands something, that command doesn't itself have any inherent to-be-doneness. So therefore, he doesn't think that morality can be objective with even if God exists. And where I'm going to sort of make my objection is just because there's no inherent to-be-doneness or to be followed or any like necessarily logical reason to care about what God says or any practical reason, that doesn't mean it's not objective or isn't, objective in the sense that we use when we say anything's objective. So the first thing we need to ask is, what do we actually mean by objective? I think it's obvious. It doesn't just mean a consensus, partially because we all now believe, or most of us believe, that it's an objective fact that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. But there was a time back in the day that people thought that the sun revolved around the Earth. So consensus isn't going to be this way that we find objective truths. I think one of the things we can say is it actually has to be mind independent or independent of human minds. In the sense that if consensus changes or people change their minds, there is some sort of ultimate reality or truth. So when I think of moral objectivity, I mean that murdering babies for fun is like a bad or a wrong thing. That is actually a fact. That is like a true statement, just the same way that, if a tree falls in the forest, it generates acoustic waves. Whether or not there are people there in the forest to actually hear it and it turns into a sound that they perceive is kind of a different story. But by objective, do we necessarily mean independent of all minds, including, let's say, God or, an omniscient mind like God? And that's where I think we can say, does it? I'm going to argue no, and I'm going to explain why. So the first thing I want to say is there are a couple options that the theist has to respond to this criticism that, just because we have no reason, logical reason for following why we should care about the commands of God, outside of very serious practical reasons, if you accept that God exists, that doesn't necessarily make it less true. That'd be the first thing I would say. Say gravity is true, right? I like have this pen, I drop it. That's like I would like to argue it's a fact, right? It's, people say it's a theory, but I think we can argue that gravity, most of us would agree at least that gravity is objectively true or an objective fact. But there's not necessarily a reason that you should believe it to be true. Like if somebody says, hey, Paul, like every time you drop something, it's going to fall closer to the earth. And I told them, well, why should I care? Why should I care if it's true? Like that doesn't make it less true or less objective. So that would, I guess, be my first objection is it could still be an objective fact, even if there isn't necessarily some inherent to be doneness just because God commands it. Like God saying something and not providing us a practical reason to care about it wouldn't make his commands any less mind independent or any less true to reality. The other thing I think we could say is somebody could make the argument then is, well, isn't all moral truth then relative to God? You're just pushing relativity back an area. Yeah, we have our own minds and there's people who have their own moral codes and then cultures have their own moral codes, but isn't all like moral codes relative to God if he's making these commands? And I would argue, yes, but that makes the objective-subjective distinction kind of useless because everything is relative to God. I mean, I'd even argue that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, like logic and the laws of nature and all these things are relative to God. So this just because it's relative doesn't necessarily mean it's not objective or not mind independent, in the sense that God is this like ultimate reality and necessary being. So it's like everything is relative to God in that sense. So if you're going to say that, okay, morality is an objective because God commands that, then maybe you may even have to throw out logic. You may have to say, okay, well, logic is relative to God having the axioms of logic. Or you could make the argument that mathematics is relative to the axioms of mathematics being true in some sense. And if I make a proof, it's only objectively true relative to the propositions that I'm assuming to be true in mathematics, and that logic works. And same thing with science, right? That it's relative to the external world existing and the mathematical models being accurate and all of these things. So I think this, once again, when I'm saying objective and subjective, when I'm saying objective morality, I mean, there's like mind independent truths, not necessarily that they just are what they are and they just exist kind of magically out there. That's kind of the case. And one of the ways I would make this point is both atheists and theists who at least, behave what we consider to be morally will emphasize sort of accountability to other agents. And I would argue to be done this generally involves some level of responsibility or accountability. So if I loan money, if my friend loans me money and I feel like I ought to pay him back, maybe there's this practical concern that if I could get away with not paying him back, but it would hurt my relationship with him, or he wouldn't loan me money in the future. So I feel this level of responsibility to my buddy, so I pay him the money back. And I think in the same way, we ought to do what God commands because, at least from a Christian perspective, and probably true about any of the Abrahamic religions, because if you're a Christian, you believe that you're going to be held accountable to these things, and you're going to, by an omniscient agent who watches what you do. And as a result, living your life at least saying, what if every word I said or every action I took, I just kind of had to justify. I had to provide a reason to an omniscient agent who understood my background, but would expect me to give a reason for, that's what Jesus says in the Bible, like all the careless things you say. Like if I live my life saying that every word I spoke, even if nobody was around, I would have to actually give a justification for it and have a good reason or a good justification for it. I think that makes sense. And then there is this idea of to be doneness or rightness or wrongness being that, hey, like you don't want to have to justify why or maybe it'd be difficult for you to justify to an omniscient agent like God why you killed all these babies and got enjoyment out of it when you were harming them. So I think that part would make sense. I think you could make that argument as well. And then the last angle I would say is to do this in sort of the teleological way, which just basically is like, this goes from Aristotle, but I think this is the point Alistair McIntyre makes in After Virtue, which is the idea that if you create something, you get the authority to say what you created it for. And that purpose is objective in the sense that you made it. And this is why I think naturalistic forms of morality really struggle with any sort of objective morality, because in a lot of assumptions of naturalism, nature is this blind, unguided process that doesn't have any purpose or design. And as a result, trying to find some like inherent purpose in the laws of nature or inherent, to be doneness in the laws of nature is just kind of going to be misleading, or you're just kind of barking up the wrong tree if you think you can do this, if nature itself, if all of ultimate reality is a blind, unguided, uncaring process. So the analogy I'm thinking of, like, let's say I build a compass and I tell somebody, hey, the purpose of this compass is to point to magnetic north, or just to point north, right? Someone else can come along and evaluate this compass and hold this compass accountable to the purpose that I set for it without me even needing to say anything. So they can say, oh, like if they understand what my purpose was for creating the compass, they can actually evaluate whether or not this is a good or bad compass without even needing to ask me about it. So if there's this idea of a well-functioning compass or a telos, and you kind of get the authority to say what you created something for and whether something is behaving well or according to this purpose or not according to this purpose based on your understanding of what the purpose is and whether it's functioning properly in the sake of a compass. So a good compass would be one that points to north, and a bad compass would be one that doesn't. Even if that doesn't necessarily, so I guess what I mean to say is, if the compass came to me, the creator of the compass, and is like, why ought I care about why I was made? I'd kind of be a weird question. It's like, no, like you were made for this specific purpose. And you asking, or like, give me a reason to care outside of the purpose that you made for me. It's kind of like, no, that's the whole point. There's no, like, I made you to do this purpose. And if you need a reason to care about that outside of caring about the purpose that I made you for, like, that's the reason in and of itself. But that wouldn't necessarily make that telos any less objective, in the sense that other people understanding my reasons for making it could all agree like what a good and a bad functioning compass is, even if an individual compass, if it could talk, maybe would doubt whether or not it had any obligation or cared or anything like that. So once again, kind of interesting pulling apart this level of objectivity from teleology. And I think this is why naturalism struggles so much with any objective morality, because what you're doing is you're taking this idea of what, trying to impose an idea of what a well-functioning person is, and usually it involves some like vague humanistic, egalitarian, tolerance-based ethics that generally come from a theistic tradition, and people try to say, well, you ought to do this or you ought to care about this, and you have all these people who are saying, no, that contradicts the reason you believe this was here in the first place, right? You may say, okay, like, I believe this compass should point to north, and then somebody else is saying, well, there's no such thing as magnetic north in the first place. So there's no such thing. Like if the compass just randomly came about and there was no design and no intentionality behind it, then they could make their own idea of, okay, well, I say a compass ought to do this, but that doesn't give the compass a reason to change their mind either, because why should it care about what this other person says? There's this sort of epistemic parity between each compass. So that's, I think, the main challenge here. So I think the idea of God being this mind-independent being who offers commands, even if somebody could not always have a logical reason to care about following those commands, doesn't necessarily make them less objective. I guess that would be my argument. So anyway, let me know what you think. Let me know if you think this is a good response. I'm curious. Yeah, just discuss. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.